Yeah. Sometimes it works. Yeah. Really? Yes. Oh, yeah. 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 Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have attention, please? All quiet, please. Thank you. So, yeah, we're making a video for today's class. Go ahead, take your notes out. We're going to be continuing delving into the Algerian War. Okay? Algerian War. And I know, actually, having been communicated with, I think, two of you guys, among other students, you've got your revised IA due. And honestly, some of you guys, if you turn in something very, very similar to what you did before, that's fine. I'll handle a couple of questions and so forth after school with some students that they got some really burning questions that they have, which is fine. But remember, very soon, we're going to be sitting down and having individual meetings on your paper. And I'll give you lots of feedback on how to make that perfected for the final version, which is due when? The final version is due when? Jack, when's the final version due? Before then. End of the semester now is in January. Yeah, so right before Christmas break. I've got like the 18th as the due date for that. So that I have something to do over break. Yeah, you guys will be like reviewing classes and stuff like that. Yeah, for in here, if we're kind of where we hopefully are going to be, you'll have as your semester final a unit test. Like probably the last Cold War unit. Okay? So, for here, we've got that, the revised IA, so print that out, bring that with you to class on Thursday, and then be prepared for a 10-point quiz just covering the Indo-Pakistan Algeria notes, okay, which we're going to be doing today. We're going to finish up Algeria. Is that okay? Are you ready for it, Trenton? No? What, are you afraid like something bad is going to happen if we talk about what happens between France and its colony Algeria? A lot of these stories are pretty sad. That's why I was reminding students in the 11th grade, when you pick your topic, because they're doing their first draft this semester, and when you pick your topic, you don't have to pick wars and genocide and all kinds of things. How many of you guys would say your history IA topic is cheerful, or at least not depressing? What's yours? Cars. There you go, cars. Anybody have a depressing topic? Serial killers. Yeah, the Holocaust. Jimmy, yeah, there's a lot of good before he dies. Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be depressing. And yours? No, it's a politics, Yeah. Yours is, what's yours? Oh, Ruby Ridge. Yeah, that's right, yeah. And yours is depressing, isn't it? It's killing, yeah. Mary, yours is happy, isn't it? Oh, yeah, there's some cool stuff going on there. Right? South Africans and British fighting each other and Americans. And so, yeah. All right, questions? Yes? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You've noticed that. I've started to include, grades and things, little buffer things, because, Ellie was like, I like the daily warm-up. I like the formative question. We don't have time for all that. So we're kind of doing a alternative, sort of cushiony sort of thing, which the 11th graders, they really needed it because they had chapter 27 quiz, and it's whoa. I've graded one set, and one student aced it. They were serious about looking up all of the different things from that chapter. It was the Spanish-American War, kind of American imperialism chapter and so forth. They did great. Others needed that little bolster thing because they got rocked a bit on that first quiz. Sorry, you really do. And it's a reminder. It's if you're going to read material and be held accountable for it, whether it's an IA or whatever, you really do need to pay attention to that. Okay? And you guys have learned that, and you guys are in a good position on that. So yeah, you've got a nice little cushiony beginning grade. And I'm actually not giving a grade to the revised IA. That's just sort of an opportunity for people to get their things up if they didn't have it up there before. So that's not a grade. The Algerian, Pakistan, whatever thing, that's going to be a grade, 10 points and so forth. Okay? Do you have a question, or do you want to?
I'm just going to interrupt.
Go for it. No, go for it.
Good morning, everybody. Hey, the air quality out there is in the red.
Yeah.
Just running outside. So I'll interrupt since you guys are seniors. I know some of you choose to leave. Make sure you're on time coming back. 30 minutes isn't long. And otherwise, you'll have to be in your elective class.
Oh, in the elective class?
Yeah, that's the class that has prior to lunch.
Oh, so just stay in there? So
Yep.
Mr. Blevins'
Yep.
group is going to, like, hang out here
Yep.
afterwards? Okay.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
And then I asked in the email for teachers who don't have the class supervised just to check in with their peers in case somebody needs a bathroom break.
Okay.
So, get those in there.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you. Right here? Oh, I did? Oh, my mistake. It should be 4 to 4. That was just my mistake, putting in a 3 instead of a 4. I'll fix it. Yeah, sorry about that. You didn't wipe your desks down well enough. Like, gosh, I did a black light on it. It was like, oh, no, that was my mistake. Because it's like, based on the number of days in the week. So what's it going to be for this week? 5 out of 5, actual days. Because you guys are still doing work at home, aren't you? Yes, Mr. Hanson, we are, just like all the at-home students. Yes, Mr., we are. I mean, no, I know you guys, you actually do have a lot of work at home, don't you? Yeah, okay, so. And mine, typically, you can kind of spread it out and so forth, all right. And when we get through the Algeria, Indo-Pakistan quiz and so forth, we'll get into the next Cold War Part 2 of 3. And so we'll have a nice, lovely long unit. And then I'll be setting up times to have individual conversations with you. Any other questions? Okay, let's get to it. Okay, Algeria. There's a war in Algeria. And the war in Algeria is between predominantly Algerian Muslims versus the French. Okay, so to follow this as far as organizationally and so forth, this is going to be, it's kind of like a civil war in the country, okay? So on the one side, this is an independence war. Sorry, I was reading the other things. There's an independence war, although there are people who are Algerian, write this down, there are Algerian Muslims who are on the side of the French. Make sure you write that down, because it's not as simple as, oh, I'm Algerian, I'm Muslim, those guys are French, I'm on this side, they're on the other side. In fact, there is a significant number of Algerian Muslims who are loyal to France. They will be referred to as the Harkis. Do you see that in your notes, that term, Harkis? Okay? The Colons are sometimes referred to as the Pied Noirs. I think I'm probably mispronouncing that. Sometimes referred to as vigilantes. Those are sort of like the white descendant Europeans. Their allies in this fight are the Harkis, so they're loyal to France. So they're actually in a difficult position because other Algerian Muslims look upon them as being, traitors, as not being, part of the cause and so forth. Okay, you got that? So they're very much involved in this war. It's going to get complicated when we look at some of the various different sides, but know this. When it's all said and done, Algeria will be independent. But it's going to be very complicated as we go along. All right? Now, just as a reminder, actually I like this map. I found this one, and you can see. This is the sort of the sequence of the takeover of Algeria. But to be clear, by the early mid-1800s, the most important populous areas of Algeria, where they have resources and the ability to live, had been taken over by the French. So the French had this territory really onwards of like at least 100 years before this Algerian War of Independence was taking place. Okay? Who put pressure on the French to maybe consider perhaps like moving out of there? Ellie, who would you say was putting a little bit of pressure maybe on France to sort of like, hey, you know, maybe you don't need to have an empire, you don't need to have a colony anymore. Who? Well, the Algerians, a lot of the Algerians are like, okay, you can go now. Who outside of this area and so forth is saying, maybe you want to consider perhaps possibly like moving out? Britain, although Britain's kind of in the same boat because in Britain they're having this debate over could we hang on to some of our empire? Was it America? Yeah, so there's a little bit of a message from America during this time period too, like, although most of the critical decisions are going to be made within the French population. Because France is France, and you don't just tell France that they have to leave. And if you're the United States of America, it's kind of like someday you might be in this position where you have the resources, you have the intellect, you have the responsibility, you have all the things, and now you're telling your parents what's good for them. You guys looking forward to that? Being responsible for some of those kinds of things? Not that that's a perfect analogy, but France and Britain were great empires in the 1800s and, say, early 1900s and so forth. Now the United States is the leader of that alliance. And so, but good luck. The United States doesn't get too involved in this. Put this down. It's going to be the French opinion. And the French opinion will change very much during the course of this war. Because this is one of those wars that drags out. And in history, sometimes you get wars that drag out over a long period of time, and eventually you get people in that country that are like, I'm tired of fighting that war, we should quit. Who was tired of fighting the American War of Independence and decided, that's enough? Britain, exactly. Thank you very much. Okay, who was going to be, we haven't gotten to this yet, but the Vietnam War, who's going to be tired of fighting that war and go, can we just declare victory and like call it done? Who's going to get up at the end of the day in Afghanistan, the United States and leave, or the Taliban and leave? It's probably going to be the United States. Okay? All right. So let's look at kind of how these things play a part. Within, you got the French political situation, and you have the situation in Algeria, and it's kind of muddy, right? So if you're a Muslim living in Algeria, are you necessarily for independence? No, but you likely are. Most of them are going to be supportive. The main Algerian independence movement, there's the name of the top leader, Ferhat Abbas, and his group is the FLN, which stands for, you ready? FLN, of course, it's French, National Liberation Front. National Liberation Front. So that's the main political military group because it's like French and Spanish. They always kind of like reverse the order in the thing. So if you were to actually say, it would be like the Front Liberation Nationale or something like that. That's the way it is. So like what is the biggest political party in Mexico? PRI, which stands for the Institutional Party of Revolution or something like that. So anyway, I'm in. Like, get used to that. Yeah, so like the order changes and stuff. Okay, so Ferhat Abbas, and they're going to be involved very much beginning November 1st, 1954. That's when things really start rocking. That's kind of when the war gets started. Okay, and Ferhat Abbas and the FLN, using the resources they have available, will conduct a series of attacks against French military and political installations in Algeria, but I want you to also write this too. There will also be attacks taking place in France itself. Okay? So one of the things that goes on during the Algerian War of Independence is that sometimes components of it spill over into France itself. Okay? Because, I mean, it's not that far away, and if you're Algerian and you want to attack sort of French assets in France, you just need to get across the water. So that's going to make it a little bit more of a challenge for the French. Having said that, most of the fighting in this war does take place in Algeria. Okay? So that's the main group that is leading the effort for independence. Now let's complicate it a little bit. You ready? Because sometimes you get other groups that are saying, no, we're the true independence leaders. I don't have a slide on that yet. No, we don't have a slide on that yet. But the other group that is very much in favor of independence, You see it in your notes there. It is called the Algerian National Movement, which of course the acronym is MNA. Thank you. Algerian National Movement. They're going for the same goal, Algerian independence, but they want something different. Think of them as being a more left-wing political group. Okay? They're a left-wing political group. So for example, at the end of the day, you've got these two groups that are competing with each other for like, what is Algeria going to look like as an independent country? The MNA wants it to be very much sort of like a socialist, leftist kind of a country. Not so much for the FLN. They're going to be looking for something different, maybe a little bit more traditional along the lines of Algerian national thought. Do you understand how that makes sense? Okay? So they're actually going to be fighting with each other at times, in addition to fighting against the French government and their supporters in Algeria. Do you follow that? Okay? Now, here is an interesting thing that takes place, and it's kind of like with the American Revolution. Anybody know who won the most battles in the American Revolution, the British or the Americans? The British actually won a lot of battles, but here was the brilliance of George Washington in the American cause. It drug the war out over a long period of time, and public opinion in Britain started turning against it. Write this down. The war gets drug out a long time. The Algerian War of Independence gets drug out a long time. And eventually, French public opinion starts to turn against it. Listen carefully. Opinion in France, but not necessarily among the French in Algeria. Many of them are like, we need to continue fighting this. And in fact, they point to facts on the ground. How is the actual military fight going in Algeria? How is the French military doing against the FLN? The French military is actually doing pretty well against the FLN. It's hitting them pretty hard. They've got more resources, right? They're bringing in the resources. They're attacking here and they're attacking there using helicopter gunships. It's sort of like an early indication of kind of like how the Vietnam War is going to be going. Although in the end, it's kind of like, one of the things that happens, like the Algerian population starts to turn even more against the French. As the war goes on, the Algerian population turns more against the French. Why? I'll give you an example. One of the things that the French government has difficulty with when trying to find the enemy is, it's a guerrilla war. Does the enemy dress up in military uniforms and move around as military columns? No. They operate in and among the population. So the French military is like, where is the enemy? They'll go into an Algerian village and look for the enemy. And they're like, I don't know. They just see a bunch of guys. If you watched that video, which you should have, did you notice that like the enemy, the FLN, is not really uniformed? So sometimes you see the French military come and they grab some guy and they're like, you're the enemy and so forth. They just shoot him right there on the spot, right there. You're like, whoa. Anticipate this as well for the United States of America fighting in the Vietnam War. Where is the enemy? What do you do if you're not sure where the enemy is? Here's what the French did. Write this down. They rounded up masses of Algerians and put them into camps where they could keep an eye on them. So there. For security reasons, you take a vast Algerian population and you stick them in camps. Security problem solved, yes? Not ultimately. Are you winning over the hearts and minds of the Algerian people? No, and think of their economic thing. How much opportunity are you going to have to operate like, I don't know, grazing animals or farming if you're stuck in a camp? You can't. So that military solution actually turns out to be not so good for the ultimate French goal, which is to try and win the war. Okay? Some of the other tactics that start getting used in the Algerian War that we're going to be seeing later on in the Vietnam War. Napalm. Anybody know what napalm is? It first gets introduced during this particular fight and will be introduced heavily by the United States in the 1960s in the Vietnam War. Anybody know what napalm is? It does. It burns. It's like sort of like jellied gasoline thing, and you drop it from planes, and when it lands, it just like burns. Big flamey thing. All right. So that's like a military innovation and so forth. against villages and that they've got right there. Okay? So it's weird. You've got this fighting going on between the French military as well against the FLN. It looks like it's winning, but it's having problems. Now, let's just remind ourselves how, because we covered this already, didn't we? As far as like France in Southeast Asia. Did we talk about Dien Bien Phu, 1954, when France is trying to hold on to Vietnam? Just make a little side note. France's efforts to hang on to its empire are not going so well in certain parts. In 1954, they lose a big battle in Southeast Asia to the Viet Cong, and France quits Southeast Asia. French public opinion no longer supports the French Empire in Southeast Asia. And French public opinion is starting to turn against the war in Algeria. Write that down. And now it's going to get really complicated and it's going to get really, really sticky. French public opinion. Things are really, really, really unstable in France in the 1950s. They lost Southeast Asia to a military conflict, and now they're in the midst of a military conflict in Algeria. The colonists, the Pieds Noirs, the colons, they want the military to stay. Lead generals, now let's introduce these guys. Leading generals for the French military also want to continue the fight and beat the FLN. They want to continue. These two are critical. You see them being decorated here. The two generals relative in this situation, we've got General Jacques Massu and General Raoul Salon. If you watch the video, you'll see they come in very prominently in that. Now, here's what you need to understand about France and its military. There had been a time in French history where the military got involved in politics. Best example, Napoleon. Very, very popular, successful general. During a time of political instability in France, he steps in and takes control. And he becomes ultimately the emperor. So it's not unheard of in France for the military to step in. Can you think of another country we covered prior to World War II, where the military looked at some instability and said, we're going to take over? Do you remember that one, Mary? What was that country? It's right near France. Just south of France. Southwest of France. I'll call on Daniel. What was the country that Francisco Franco, one of the top generals, decided that he was going to lead a military coup, and he won. And he was in charge of that country for many, many years thereafter. Spain, yeah, it was Spain. Yeah, it was Spain. So Spain had a tradition of the military stepping in and taking control. Watch this space, because the generals are going to take control of the situation in Algeria. Write that down. The generals, with the support, when the word starts coming across that the French government might look at actually leaving and pulling the army and pulling the generals out and letting Algeria become independent, these guys get political, okay? You've got, you literally are having in Algeria a military coup d'etat. In 1958, a military coup d'etat, led by Massu and Salon. Okay, you got that? Because they're afraid that the government of France is going to pull the plug and leave. Does that make sense? All right. Now, I think I've covered all those, yeah. Oh, let me back up one thing. There was one. You're looking in your notes and you're like, Cafe Wars. Didn't you talk about the Cafe Wars? Sorry. Write down a little subnote. Cafe Wars. Like Cafe Wars? What is that, like a fight over like the price of coffee or something? Cafe Wars actually take place in France, and there's 5,000 people roughly dead as a result of Cafe Wars. All right, this is a detail that you can add to something I told you already. Guess who the two sides are on the Cafe Wars, where they're blowing each other up and attacking each other which would, in a situation that would normally be like, hey, it's France, I'm going to hang out in the cafe and drink some wine and chat with my friends and so forth. That's part of the French lifestyle. The cafe wars were between the MNA and the FLN. Those were the two sides that were competing to be the leaders of the Algerian independence movement. So they're fighting each other in, among other places, French cafes in France. Think of them as like kind of terror attacks against each other. Okay? By the way, which of those two is going to be the prevailing group and take the lead as Algeria gains its independence? Take a guess. Yeah, Abbas. Yeah, it's going to be Abbas is going to be like among the leaders of Algeria as it gains independence. Go for it, sorry.
So, I know you kind of why would it be separate? Like, what was the difference?
The biggest difference, think the FLN is going to be more sort of traditional. I don't want to say Islamist. I don't think they necessarily wanted to set up an Islamic government, but they didn't buy into that communist sort of socialist component that that was very much a part of the MNA. Okay, does that make sense? So it's political differences. Okay, and both see an opportunity to gain something and kick the French out, and so forth. All right. Now, in the midst of all of this, let's be clear on this. The Algerian crisis broke the French government, and I'm not just talking about like led to, the election of another leader. Because let's back it up for a moment here. Let's back it up for one moment. What is the French government like? What is the French governmental system like as we go into this Algerian war? Here's the answer. The French Fourth Republic, think of it as like the French Constitution for a republic, no king, the fourth time. I mean, we're still on United States Constitution 1.0, although we do have 27 amendments and Supreme Court decisions and so forth. But in France, at the end of World War II, they created a constitution for the Fourth Republic, which was very much like the Third Republic, which was the government that was in place in France when the Nazis came and defeated it. Now, here's what you need to know about the Fourth Republic. You ready to write this down? Real power rested in the legislature, the National Assembly. You're like, well, isn't that where real power is? I mean, among the people who were elected? Well, not necessarily, because there were some people that said, part of the problem of France during the Third Republic, and it's going to happen again in the Fourth Republic, is that if we don't have one strong elected national executive, got that? Strong national executive. A president with real power, elected by the people, because here was the problem of the Fourth Republic. They had all these different coalitions that were formed among political parties. It's hard to imagine that in the United States because we got two really big political parties. But in France and a number of other European countries, they have a multitude of political parties. Same thing in Spain and so forth. And sometimes it's really hard to get things done because they're always like forming and reforming and coalitions and they're breaking apart. And it's just stymie. You can put this down. During the early years of the Algerian War, French governments were falling left and right. Now, I mean, when I say falling, it was like coalitions were falling apart, and so they would reform, and so it was just like a lot of stagnation. The French military people were frustrated with, the French people were frustrated with it. The generals were frustrated with it, because they're like, can't we get a clear direction as to what we're doing, right? Now, there was one person who was looking in at the whole thing, and he had a lot of credibility among a lot of French people. If you saw in the video already, you know exactly who I'm talking about. There he is. Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle is a fascinating figure. He's going to be the person who is most instrumental for ending the war in Algeria. And he ends it in a way that some people don't expect it. Let me back up on Charles de Gaulle for a moment. Charles de Gaulle was a general, not the top general, but among the generals in the French military going into World War II. France surrendered. And some of the generals actually played roles in the Vichy government, the Nazi-dominated government. De Gaulle made his way over to Britain. And he was a leader of the Free French movement during World War II. All right? And who won in World War II? Yeah, what happened to the government, the French generals who cooperated with the Nazi regime? Are they held up to esteem? No. De Gaulle is held up to esteem in France because he's part of the winning forces. He's a Free French. And he comes in and he says, French people, you need to have a constitution with a strong presidency. Otherwise, we're going to end up with problems like we did under the previous Third Republic. You got that? So his advice was a strong presidency. They didn't take his advice. And he's like, well, fine. I will not participate in your politics. I'm going to take my ball and I'm going to go home. So he did not participate in French politics throughout the 1950s. All right? And everyone's looking at him like, but you're great. You're going to solve this. In fact, so many people turned to him and said, solve this crazy problem of this Algerian war. And he says, I will do this under my terms. Guess what his terms were? His terms were a new constitution for France. His terms were for a new constitution, get this, what, strong legislature or strong presidency? Strong presidency, very good. A strong presidency. What do you think? Is he going to run for president under that new constitution? He does. Is he going to have much opposition? No, he's very popular. Now he's sort of like on the right of the French political spectrum, okay? Not really socialist, but he's a little bit on the right. Now here is where things get very interesting. Because as you saw in the film, if you haven't seen it yet, watch it. He goes to Algeria. He goes to Algeria during this crisis. And who is cheering him on? The Algerian Muslims? Or the colons, the white settlers who are looking to win the war? You don't know? Who's cheering him on? Here he is in Algeria. I am going to solve this. It's the white settlers. They think he's on his side. Write that down. They think he's on his side. Okay? And so, the Fifth Republic is created September 1958. The presidential election is held. And I want to say at that time it was like a 7-year presidency. It was pretty long, and there's a lot of authority given to the president. De Gaulle is elected in February 1959. And here is what he does. He goes back to Algeria, and he says,